it'll help if I turn the microphone on. If I were to ask you the question of what comes to mind when I mention the man Solomon? What comes to mind? Wisdom, okay? What did you say? Temple, okay. Yep, what else? Lust. Wisdom, women, and if we come up with a W for temple, we've probably got his life pretty well summarized. And we're going to focus, and I took in Kings, it's going to be a challenge to divide this one somewhat reasonably, I'm just going to tell you. But I want to look today at Solomon and his portion of this. But there's a lot that's going to take place. We'll look at this here in just a little bit, but Kings is going to cover a really extensive period of Israel's history. And, unfortunately, there are times when things are going very well. And then there are times when things are not going so well. So let's look at this survey and see what we can glean from it. Who wrote it? Well, let's just say the author is anonymous. There's a lot of speculation on this. There has been a tremendous amount of study that has been done, and I'm going to say that there is lots of speculation. I'll also say that there are lots of very complex theories that are out there. And so to summarize it, and if you pick up even just some of the basic commentaries, if you read some of the introductory material, you may see things like redaction and stuff like that. Let me just explain what happens is there's different material that's out there. So the Kings is going to be written from 3 different sources. I'll show you that here in a little bit, but there's different material. And so who compiled all of this? Where did they get the information from? That's kind of the idea. So the kings would keep their own records. Interestingly, they would typically keep war records of their victories, not their defeats, okay? We forgot about those. And so, you find these, and it's been interesting. Some of the archaeologists that have uncovered various things, and you read of all these battles where they were victorious, but they never lost a single battle, yet they died in battle. So it's kind of an entertaining thing. But there's a lot of debate about this, and is it multiple authors? Is it one single author? Where did they get all of the material from? Well, we don't necessarily know, but there's at least 3 sources indicated in Kings. Let me give you these references. 1 Kings chapter number 11, verse 41. The rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? We don't have that. That's not a biblical book, but it was a record that was there. And this record kept track of some of the things that he did. And so some of the material was at least taken from there. 1 Kings chapter 14 talks about Jeroboam, and it talks about his acts, and they are written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. So this is not necessarily Chronicles as in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but just we might say the annals of the kings of Israel, their records, and they were kept up there. Then there's another one, 1 Kings chapter 15, Abijam, and everything that he did, was it not written for us now in the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So at least 3 sources that Kings itself mentions, and that's going to give us a little bit of an idea of, where some of this material at least came from. There's been a lot of study that has gone on, and more recent scholarship has suggested that there's a link between the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. And they'll call this the Deuteronomic history. And what it does is it focuses on how Deuteronomy and the impact of what Moses said as they were about to enter into the promised land. Remember, Deuteronomy now is going to take place right on the plains of Moab. They're just east of the Jordan River. We've got them there in Numbers. Now, we've taken a couple delays in some of our services. We'll take another delay tonight. We're not going to be in Balaam. But so they're right there on the plains of Moab. This is actually where Moses is going to die. Right before he dies, he gives them his farewell address. That, in essence, is the book of Deuteronomy. There are certain things in Deuteronomy that are different from Genesis through Numbers. That's the anticipation of their possession of the land. So, for example, you get into Deuteronomy 17, and you find where there is information about, all right, when you choose a king, this is what you need to be mindful of. And I'm going to look here at some of that in just a little bit. But so here's what you need to be mindful of. When you have a king, this is what they're going to do. You want to be sure that they're not taking horses to themselves and acquiring all this massive wealth and so forth. Well, then you find out later on in Deuteronomy, for example, Deuteronomy 28 is going to give us the blessings and the curses. If you will stay true to the Mosaic covenant, to the law, you're going to be blessed. And if you deviate, you're going to be cursed. And it's very specific as to how these curses end up taking place. So then you get into Kings and Chronicles. Judges would also be included, but Joshua and Judges, you'll see the settlement of land. Samuel, you're dealing with some judge early on, and then David, you start the period of the monarchy with Saul and David, and then Solomon is going to pick us up here in 1 Kings. But then all of a sudden, things digress significantly. And why is it that God allowed the Assyrians to take the northern kingdom into captivity? Why is it that God allowed the Babylonians 140 years later, approximately, to take the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, into captivity? Why did God do this? Well, that was in direct keeping with what he said would happen all the way back in Deuteronomy several hundred years before. And so trying to discern who wrote all of this is somewhat challenging for us. Tradition would hold to one of three individuals, Jeremiah being one, Ezekiel or Ezra. Those are three fairly common suggested ones, but we really don't know. The work in and of itself is largely anonymous. When was it written? Well, that gives us a little bit more insight. We're going to have to throw, again, a wide date on this. We're going to say from approximately 560 BC to 538 BC. Why do we say that? Well, if you were to go into a library and pick up an encyclopedia that was written in 1935, they probably would not talk about World War II. Okay? Because it hadn't happened yet. Now, if you pick up an encyclopedia in 2012 that has not talked about World War II, it's probably not a very good encyclopedia. Okay? That's information that has really been around for quite some time. When you get all the way to the end of 2 Kings, and we'll kind of consider 1 and 2 Kings, when I say Kings, we're thinking of these as one book, okay? But we get all the way to the end of 2 Kings, it talks about an individual by the name of Jehoiakim and his release. His release took place in about 560 BC. I'm wanting to say, if I'm remembering from the text, that it was the 37th year of a reign, but it puts it about 560. Okay, now, the Jews are permitted to return to their land, 538, 539 BC. But there's no mention of that in Kings. Now, that would be a pretty big history piece to miss. Kind of like an encyclopedia being written in 1952 and missing World War II. It just finished. Okay? And so to look at it and say, well, the fact that this was not mentioned would suggest then that probably it was actually written prior to that, but it takes us all the way up to this individual's release in about 560. So probably somewhere between there. Now, I want you to think about this because Solomon is going to assume the throne in 970. Can we just use round numbers for giggles' sake? 970 to 560, we're talking over 400 years of history that is going to be recorded here. During this period of time, the prophets are going to get interspersed. Okay? So you're going to find Isaiah ministering here and Jeremiah ministering here and Ezekiel in the captivity. He's actually going to be a little bit later on. You find all of these individuals and where they come. And some are sent to Israel, some are sent to Judah, some seem to function to both. Some are sent to other nations. Jonah sent to Nineveh. Obadiah was sent to Edom, for example. But this is the time frame when all of these things are going to be taking place. Why? Because overall, the nation of Israel is not going the right direction. And so everything that is taking place is starting to say, okay, well, how did all of this happen and what happened to Israel? Because you go into Genesis and here's this covenant that's made, and wow, everything looks great. I mean, there's a lot of threats in Genesis, but it still holds itself true. Exodus, all of a sudden, they're in Egypt. How are they going to get back to their promised land? Well, God's got that. He'll just use Moses to do that. Gets them all the way to the promised land. Now you've got a group that's untrained militarily, yet they're going to conquer the promised land. And Joshua's going to lead that. God's got this. Judges, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Lots of a vicious cycle of rebellion that we talked about. Ruth, finally a bright spot, okay, in a very dark period of history. 1 Samuel, Saul, now we start to the monarch. We're going to reject God's rule. We're going to start to the monarch. Saul, oh boy, tall, dark, and handsome. This is what we want in a leader. No, not what we want in a leader. He's a jealous man, and David ends up being crowned, given the kingdom. Yet that still takes years before he actually ends up assuming the throne. David, everything's looking great. We saw last time in 2 Samuel, and we hit the sin in with Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11, and things just go down from there. Now it's going to go to Solomon, and it's okay, and then it's going to divide. And if you had a cliff, okay, and that's essentially what is going to end up happening. And so there's a lot that is going to be here, and this is going to be when some of these prophets are going to come in and minister, and they are going to have an extremely difficult message to stand before this king, this extremely wicked king, and say, you are the reason for this judgment. Think of Elijah. Ahab, it's not going to rain until I say it's going to rain. And turns around and walks out. That's to a king. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of courage that is going to be here. Why was the book of 1 Kings, or why were Kings written? First, I think we can establish several different lessons. Number one, it's going to establish for us lessons from history. We have talked much about history and the importance of learning from the past, okay? If we don't learn from the past, we're bound to repeat it, all right? And if we don't pay attention to it, we're bound to repeat it. America's not been any exception to this, and we're still not going to be. There are three distinct periods of history that are going to be covered in the books of 1 and 2 Kings. You're going to have the period of the undivided kingdom. This is going to be under the rule of Solomon, and it's going to go, I'm going to throw some round dates, 970 to about 931. So everything's going well under Solomon, well, for a while, and towards the end, unfortunately, it does not. And then the second major period of history is a divided kingdom, and that's going to end up taking place from 931, and then Israel's going to be taken captive in 722. So what you're going to find then is we'll see kings of Israel, that's up in the northern 10 tribes, and then you'll see kings of Judah in the south, and then these two are going back and forth, and it's difficult. The chronology of Kings is a real challenge to figure out because that is just not an easy study at all. So you've got kings over their reigns are overlapping. You've got some that come along and usurp an authority, usurp the throne. You've got others that it seems as though they reigned, like for example, when he was 8 years old, and then how did he really reign when he was 8? Did he have this council? And so there's a lot of questions there. I'm not too interested in being led by an 8-year-old in a government, and so it's a challenge to try to figure all of that out. But you'll see the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. Well, there's never a good king in Israel in the 10. There's a couple good ones in the south, but not many. So now you have a divided kingdom, and now all of a sudden in 722 BC, the Assyrians come, boom, there goes Israel. There goes the northern 10 tribes. Now, wouldn't you think that the guys in the south would look at that and say, wow, we should probably pay attention to that? They didn't. Beginning in about 605 BC, 606, somewhere in that area, is the first of three captivities, the final one ultimately in 586, and now Judah's taken into captivity. So three distinct periods of history from Israel's perspective, and there needs to be a lesson that is learned. What's the Bible say? Well, Proverbs 14, verse 34, I don't have this in your notes because this just came to my brain. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. We are no exception. And it's interesting to me to see where our country is right now. If you've paid any attention to things in recent days, it's sad to see really where we are as a nation. Righteousness exalts a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. Proverbs 14:34. And this is something that is going to be exemplified in nation after nation after nation. And undoubtedly it's seen here as well. There's also another principle, I think, that we can learn, or another purpose. It establishes the standard of the Mosaic covenant. We find in Deuteronomy 17, if you want to turn there, you can. If not, that's fine. I'm going to read just a couple of verses from this passage, because it's going to talk about when they enter the land and how things are to function and things to be a little bit different. Deuteronomy 17, I want to actually begin in verse 14. When thou art come unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me. This is Moses saying, when you say this, they're going to say this in several hundred years. Wow. Okay. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord has said, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. So, all right, you're going to choose a king. All right, he must be from the nation of Israel. He cannot lead them back into Egypt. He cannot be in this to amass his own wealth, verse 17. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. What does the Bible tell us about Solomon rather? Of many wives. I'm going to end up with you guys having your fingers in too many places here. 1 Kings 11. Let me just read a verse to you. But King Solomon, verse 1, loved many strange women. Doesn't mean weird, foreigners. He had, according to verse 2 of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, you shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. 700 wives, according to verse 3. With 300 concubines. The end of verse 3, his wives turned away his heart. What did Moses say? Do some quick math. 450 years, almost 500 years before. Don't do this lest they turn your heart from the Lord. It's exactly what happened. Oh, no, I can handle it. No, you can't. A corrupt conversation, corrupt lifestyle, okay, corrupts good manners. The rotten apple spoils the good. Never reverses that process. And, I think it'll be okay. They're my friends. No. Well, I love that person. No. Why did Solomon have this many wives? Probably to obtain an alliance with other nations and the wealth. And so this is for the protection of Israel. Wisest man who ever lived had 1,000 women. Makes me feel pretty good about myself and my level of intelligence, okay? But I mean, you think about 700 wives and 300 concubines. That is, okay? And all of the gods that they came with from pagan nations. There was nothing good about this. Well, it goes on in Deuteronomy 17. He's not to multiply. Verse 18, it shall be when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, he shall write him a copy of the law in a book out of that which is before the priests, the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read there in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of his law and these statutes, and to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may that he may prolong his days, in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Well, unfortunately, He doesn't do that. And Kings is going to actually show how, in part, 1 Kings 17, verses 14 through 20 is not followed. It also is going to show Deuteronomy 28, not going to take the time to look at that, but in the first 15 verses approximately, you find the blessings for doing what's right. And then in remarkable detail, it is told this is what's going to happen if you defy God. You're going to be taken into captivity. You're going to go to a land where you don't know their language. Now, 400 years later, it's exactly where they end up going, to Babylon. And you'll go to where you don't know their gods. You'll be a stranger in their land, and that was exactly what happened. Now, I'll be an exception to that, right? No. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap, but not me. Be sure your sin will find you out. Yeah, that's right. You, not me. That's not how this thing works. And we are so easily deceived on so many levels. Well, number 3, I think a third purpose for us is that it establishes confidence in the Davidic kingdom, or in the Davidic covenant, rather. So let me just get you to think just for a little bit. I don't want it to be too long. I know it's still early. But put yourself in the nation, or the tribes of Judah, the southern kingdom. You've seen the northern kingdom go into captivity, but you've also been told from David that his throne's going to continue forever. Jerusalem is the place that God's named. God has chosen to place his name there in Jerusalem. The temple, it's there. And so when you get some knucklehead like Jeremiah coming in and saying, hey, if you guys don't straighten out, y'all are going to be defeated. Oh, no. See, that's not going to happen because we are in Jerusalem. Well, no, it's going to be completely, no, Jeremiah, you're crazy. We've got the temple here. This is where God is. He is not going to let that happen. And so, we need to get rid of this guy. This guy is old. He's outdated. His message is irrelevant. He's causing trouble among the people. Let's kill him. That's Jeremiah's ministry. If you don't believe me, read the book of Jeremiah. Let's get rid of this man. Well, there might be a little bit of struggle. 2 years, just a brief interval. Not 70 like this old guy's saying. And then all of a sudden, Nebuchadnezzar not only goes against, which by the way, the Assyrians got up to Jerusalem. You remember that? 185,000 died in one night. They stopped that. Okay? We're safe in Jerusalem. Now, it sure would stink to live outside Jerusalem. Taxes are a lot higher in Jerusalem. It's okay because we're safe there. Now the Babylonians lay siege to Jerusalem, and all of a sudden the city ends up being taken. And in 586, something virtually unthinkable to the Jew, the temple was completely destroyed. Now, some of Israel's finest are taken into captivity. Daniel was in the first wave. Ezekiel, I believe, is in the second wave. Now, we don't even have a city, much less we don't have a king. How is this whole throne thing going to happen? How's this whole thing going to happen where God's going to promise this? It looks to me like he's abandoned us. Now we're in Babylon, and where's God in all this? And that's where these Jews would naturally be. And so Kings tells us, okay, wait a minute now, let's go back, because how did we get there? Well, how we got there was through a bunch of kings that said we're not going to do what's right. We're going to lead the nation of Israel and Judah apart from God and apart from his word. So what God said would happen actually happened. Well, we got here because we rejected all the prophets and all the messages that came to us saying, hey, you need to consider something. You need to think about your ways. You know, people don't like being wrong. I hate being wrong. Unfortunately, I am often. Okay? We want to get those things corrected. If we've got the right spirit, then let's get those things corrected. But to have a man come in and tell this leader, you're an ungodly king, you're leading the nation. No, we got this, we're fine. We've got all the prosperity, we're fine. And they weren't fine. And they rejected the truth time after time after time after time after time after time. And God said, I've had enough. And so now, here they are in the exile, and this is why most people think that the writer was someone who lived in the exile. Jeremiah didn't actually get taken into captivity, even though he's one that's often held as an author. He ends up dying, I believe it's in Egypt, if I'm remembering correctly. And so Ezra and Ezra and Ezekiel both were actually taken, and it could very well be that they wrote this particular book. But they're writing now, think about this, the group to whom they're ministering. Did God leave us? Has God completely abandoned us? And the answer was no. Because there still is going to be a scepter that's going to come out of the tribe of Judah. Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of David. He will rule on this throne forever. So there is hope. There is hope, even though they're in Babylon. There still is hope. And it really is a tremendous message. Of course, you could always add into any of these themes and purposes the faithfulness of God. Because once again, you see it. And God is faithful to do as he said he will do. That can be good and bad. Okay? If you honor him, he will bless you. If you don't, he will chastise you. But you can rest assured he will do as he said he will do. Well, let's look at some of this outline, and let's cover here the reign of Solomon, point number 1. And Solomon is now going to be the son of David and Bathsheba, and he is, and this is now after they are going to be married, but there's a transition that's going to take place beginning in chapter 1 that's really going to continue even on into chapter number 2. But let's look at, first of all, when we talk about the reign of Solomon, let's get him established first. So we'll see letter A, the establishment of Solomon. And this is going to kind of take us into the early days of his reign. Oftentimes when kings would assume the throne, it was not always an easy time of transition. They did not have policies set in place for smooth transitions. It was compounded because these kings oftentimes had many different wives and many different children. So now who gets the throne? Well, that's the issue that's going to come up in 1 Kings chapter number 1. And so beginning in 1 Kings 1, now when it picks up, we're at the tail end of David's life. So David is now old. The Bible tells us that they're struggling to keep him warm. They actually got someone, a young girl, to lie with him. Nothing immoral was done. The Bible is clear about that, just to try to keep some heat in his body. He's physically at the end of his life. Well, there's a message that comes to him and says, well, hey, wait a minute. This individual here, he set himself up for the throne, but yet you're saying Solomon's going to take the throne. Well, who's it going to be? So there's a transition that has to take place. And as the account unfolds, and I'm not going to read through all of the details, but it's not going to be Adonijah, which was the one that was initially trying to take the throne, and it ends up being Solomon. So Solomon ends up being established here in this transition, and by the time you reach chapter 2 and verse number 12, you find that Solomon, verse 12, sat upon the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was established greatly. So it was not a smooth transition, but yet it was still undoubtedly the one that the Lord wanted. Adonijah is the one that had quite the issue, and he ends up being killed in chapter number 2 as well. So not only do you see the transition from David, but secondly, you see the purging of the kingdom. Well, there were some individuals that were going to be a problem to Solomon and to his rule, and so he ends up, those individuals, and many of them are actually going to be given a chance, but yet they're going to prove themselves to be a problem, and so they are eliminated. And this establishes him now as the king. So that really takes you through the end of chapter number 2. And that purging of the kingdom was necessary for Solomon to be able to establish himself as the king. Letter B in your handout, we see the exaltation of Solomon. So now really beginning in chapter 3 and continuing through the end of chapter 8, we're going to see Solomon do really well. And there's a lot of good things that take place. Probably the most famous thing, or one of the more famous things that we know of, chapter 3, deals with, number 1, the wisdom of Solomon. So there's a dream that comes to him and says, all right, Solomon, if you could have anything you want, you name it. Boy, you want to see something that's going to reveal your heart, you be given that kind of a request. Okay? Old genie in a bottle kind of deal. I never did understand why, if you have 3 wishes, why your first wish isn't unlimited wishes. Okay? No movie was ever built that way. I don't understand it. But if you could get unlimited wishes for your first wish, to me, you're set. You're set. But Solomon, what do you want? So just think about this. If you could have one thing right now, how many of our minds immediately go to money? Or things. And what Solomon does in 1 Samuel chapter number 3, I want you to notice verse number 6. Solomon said, Thou hast showed unto thy servant David my father great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with thee. Thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in, and thy servant is in the midst of thy people which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered nor counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? I can't imagine the pressure that he would be facing as a king. I mean, I just can't imagine it. So, Lord, I want you to give me wisdom. Now, as 1 Kings 3 continues, that pleased the Lord well, and so he granted him wisdom. He granted him the additional things that most people would naturally look for, all of the wealth and so forth. Well, then you see at the end of chapter 3, his wisdom is actually exemplified. You remember the 2 women who come with a child, one dead, one living? She stole my baby. No, she stole my, that's mine. No, it's not, that's mine. Fine, we'll cut it in half. Okay? And the one is, the one who, no, let her have it. And that lady's initial response, okay, you're the mom. Okay? My other thoughts are, what about the other lady in that scene? Was she content? Fine, if I lost my child, you'll lose yours too? That is my guess, but I don't know. Surely, she's like, fine, I'll just take the legs. I don't think that would be the case, okay? And so I think probably it was, fine, I died, mine died, yours died too. Now you can feel my pain. That's my guess, but I don't know. And so Solomon demonstrates that wisdom. Now, as it goes on in 1 Kings, through these first 11 chapters, his wisdom is often drawn attention to. You see it exemplified in Proverbs. And he's not the only one who would have had these Proverbs, but certainly there's a tremendous amount of appeal to wisdom in the book of Proverbs of ordering your life correctly. So you find the wisdom of Solomon. Number 2, you find the administration of Solomon, chapter number 4. And I'm just going to mention this one rather briefly. There's a lot of the amount of things that are going on. Some of the individuals who are in his kingdom in various positions and the officers and so forth. The amount of territory over which he ruled is phenomenal. The things that were brought to him it's just mind-blowing in reality. But I do want you to notice verse 30 of 1 Kings 4. Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. Drop down to verse 32. He spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And according to the end of verse 34, or the end of chapter 4, verse 34, there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all the kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. Queen Sheba is going to be one of those later on. Well, then chapter number 3, you begin in chapter 5 with the construction of the temple. And how this is done, the number of employees is staggering. So they get the cedar trees way up north from Lebanon. And Hiram was the king, and he and David had a friendship. And he's like, hey, listen, I need these trees. Fine, yeah, we'll have them. I'll send men up to you, and nobody can cut timber like those guys up there. And so then they float it on the sea, Mediterranean Sea, down to Joppa. From Joppa, they transport these things all the way to Jerusalem. This is no easy feat, okay? And so to accomplish this, he gets, I believe it's 80,000 if I'm remembering correctly. And I want to say it's 80 anyway, without... Verse 13, King Solomon raised a levy out of all Israel. The levy was 30,000 men. He sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month by course. So you're going to go to work for a month. Work 1 month, have 2 months off. First example of shift work in the Bible. A month they were in Lebanon, 2 months they were at home. Then he had 70,000, so there's 70,000. So I guess, and 80,000 hewers in the mountains. There was the 80,000. So you got 80,000 guys cutting timbers. You've got 70,000 that are carrying things. You've got 30,000 that are sent north up to Lebanon. Now, how all of this was, and getting the stone down here, getting the timber down for this temple is phenomenal. He begins construction, and it is absolutely remarkable. The beauty of it, the detail of it, the individuals that God brings to do this. This is the place for God. And there's some I don't want to say pride, but there's a sense of worth that is put into this, and the details, the carvings. Why? Because this is God's place. And we need to, I think there's a proper application. We know as believers that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Ghost. This is God's. Okay? And what we have here, this is God's. We want to be good stewards of things. And the details, just amazing. When you read through the carvings, and then they would etch some of those carvings with gold and inlay it with gold. I mean, it had to have been absolutely beautiful. Well, that takes us all the way through the end of chapter 8. Then in chapter 9, you find some of his achievements. And there's just some things that are kind of broad things as to what happens and what God allowed him to do. The covenant is once again reiterated to Solomon. Solomon, if you'll do what God's told me to do, and I don't want to talk too much about that because that's tonight's message. If you'll do what I told you to do, then you're going to be blessed. And your throne is going to be established forever. Well, it talks about some of the accomplishments that he had beginning in chapter 9, verse 10, all the way through the end of the chapter. And there's a lot that's there. He builds his own house, some of the lands that he conquered, the people that were now under his rule. Much of that was done through David. But there were lots of, and the territory is huge by this point in time. And so there's a lot that's going on. Well, chapter 10 talks about the glory of Solomon. Number 5, the queen of Sheba hears, and so she comes to see, is all this really the case? And she gets their whole big entourage of everyone that comes with her, and that's exactly what happens. And she gets there. Man, it was exactly what what he had heard and what she had heard, and again, I'm struggling on time, I know that, but the beauty of things, I mean, the gold and the silver, I mean, the valuable stones, it's just breathtaking. I mean, it had to have been such a beautiful sight to see. But unfortunately, we move on to our final point on our outline, and that's the rebellion of Solomon. Here's all of this. Chapter 11 and verse 1, but King Solomon loved many strange women together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. It's amazing what people will cling to in love, or in the name of love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. But yet, if you read back, for example, and you read this in several passages, but in 1 Kings 9, when the second time the Lord comes to him and says, Solomon, if you'll do what's right, verse 4, if thou wilt walk before me as David thy father walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded thee, and wilt keep my statutes and my judgments. But he didn't do that. Solomon went after Ashtaroth, verse 5, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Built a high place for Chemosh. He did so for Moloch. I mean, he's going the wrong way. And the Lord, verse 9, was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned away from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice. Verse 11, wherefore the Lord said unto him, for as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. Man, so close, but not quite. You know, it's easy for us sometimes in life to have that happen, is it not? Let him that thinketh he stand take heed lest he fall. God's doing all these things in my life, and then something comes. Something derails. And boom, there I go. It's amazing to me how quickly it can happen in my life. Probably the same can happen in yours. It reminds us of the importance of being vigilant in our spiritual life, always being on guard, always being on the alert, being on the lookout, because Satan desires to destroy our lives. Let's not give him that opportunity. Lord, I thank you for the day. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the example of Solomon. I pray you'd help us to learn from this, help us to see, even out of our study, out of these books, just what you were able to show us and as to how individuals chose to conduct their lives. And I pray that we would learn from that. Lord, I thank you for each one here. I pray your blessings on this service. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless. I'll see you back here in just a few minutes.